tradition. Hope that you will make plans to join us for that event that day. I want to talk about classrooms for a moment and education and getting in trouble. So throughout the years, I know that teachers and parents, even at home, have probably used different methods for discipline. Like teachers you might get a conduct cut, or maybe it's a note home, or it's detention. One time-tested method, whether it's good or not, that I remember was getting your name on the board. And it was a difficult experience, kind of depended on what kind of kid you were. For some kids, it was very traumatic. I remember in first grade, there was a girl in our class, and she had gone all year. It wasn't until March or April when she finally got her name on the board, and she was just in tears for an hour that day. There were other kids who were like, yep, it's Tuesday, that kind of thing. The usual suspects who were just kind of waiting there for at what point that week they might get in trouble and get their name on the board. Now, I just want to give you an aside that really, we're just going to take a detour from that point just to tell you something about me, because the conversation this morning reminded me. So I was in here with the praise team praying before worship, and Jeff asked me, he goes, when you got in trouble, were you a Joshua? And I said, when I got in trouble, I was Joshua Ryan. Now I want you to notice my initials, and I want you to think of what television show my mom might have been watching. For those of you in this section, there's a TV show on in the 70s and 80s, like before I was born in some ways, called Dallas, and it featured this kind of oil tycoon named J.R. Not really a character you want to be named after, but it reminded me that I was destined to come to Dallas at some point. But yes, your preacher was born after Dallas started, if you need that time reference. But back to getting your name on the board. It was a way to call you out in front of everyone. Kind of a shameful thing. It's difficult. So it's calling one person out in front of everyone, which maybe isn't the best way. Although now that I'm an adult and have seen communications in the business world, sometimes we call no one out in front of everyone, and that's not very effective too. The memos that say, some of us need to be off of our phones when we're interacting with customers. The person who needs to know that is not going to read that. But we're calling one person out, when we're a teacher, writing their name, and everyone sees it. And that might be effective, might not be, but it sure gets your attention. When we get to the end of the book of Philippians, Paul is going to put some names on the board. The first 3 chapters, he has spent 1,200 words on great theological themes, joy and trust in the Lord and patience and suffering, all these broad topics. Then he gets to chapter 4, and he narrows down a little bit, and he writes this in Philippians chapter 4, verses 2 and 3. I plead with Euodia, and I plead with Syntyche. By the way, I did try to research the best way to say that name, and I think I'm getting it right. I plead with these people to be of the same mind in the Lord. Yes, and I ask you, my true companion, help these women, since they have contended at my side in the cause of the gospel, along with Clement and the rest of my co-workers, whose names are in the book of life. So Paul's gotten through with this letter, and then he calls them out. It's like he's conducted this great symphony, and toward the end he goes, hey, you two with the cymbals, get your act together. I don't know what's going on with this conflict, but it must be a big deal, because Paul is under house arrest in Rome, and this conflict's happening in Philippi. So whatever has happened, it's traveled 800 miles, probably with the messenger named Epaphroditus, and it's traveled westward over land in Greece. It's traveled across the Adriatic Sea and up the peninsula to find Paul in Rome. Would have taken over a month. What kind of conflict is worth that sort of journey, like makes it that far? Whatever it is, it requires a mediator. That's what Paul is asking for. And before you dismiss this in some sort of gender-specific way as some petty conflict between women, which is an unfair way to look at this, remember that there's plenty of male conflict in Scripture too. Like Peter and Paul have a deep conflict. Paul and John Mark and Barnabas have such a deep conflict that they part ways. So whatever is happening here, it might be a theological disagreement, might be just a difference of opinion on how to conduct ministry. Euodia and Syntyche are important, valued, in fact, maybe leader members of the Christian community. Paul says their names are in the book of life. He says they've worked side by side in the gospel with him. They're not nobodies. The way Paul describes them is the way he describes Timothy and Epaphroditus at other points. And he doesn't minimize their work. He could have just ignored it. He could have chastised them or taken sides. But instead, he asks for mediation because he values these two women and the work that they do among the Christians in Philippi. Because being mature Christians, being a leader, doesn't exempt us from conflict or disagreements. This shows us that unity is hard even just among two people. I want to leave Philippians for just a minute and go over to Romans. The book of Romans is probably one of the most theologically dense books in Scripture. Some people love this book. They would study it every week in their classes if they could. And some people are like, when are we going to go to James or something I can act on? You know, Romans it's just too much. It's such broad concepts. It's too theoretical. In one key passage, Paul's been talking about grace, and he says, you know, when we sin, there's even more grace. And Paul's anticipating some people going, hey, that sounds like a good equation. So if sin brings about grace, and if grace is a good thing, then we should sin more. And Paul says, well, that's a dumb argument. You died to sin. You can't keep living in it. And he talks about their baptism and burial with Christ. And he reaches this key moment in Romans chapter 6, verse 5. Paul says, if we have been united with him, that's Jesus, in a death like his, we will certainly also be united with him in a resurrection like his. For we know that our old self was crucified with him so that the body ruled by sin might be done away with, that we should no longer be slaves to sin, because anyone who has died has been set free from sin. Now, if we died with Christ, we will also live with him. Here's where we're headed for the month of March. We are going to talk about all these things that join us to Christ. We are united with him through being crucified with him, through being buried with him, and conveniently on Easter Sunday, we will end with being raised with him. And so today we're talking about this broad idea of being united with Christ. What does that mean? So back to Philippians in this conflict between Euodia and Syntyche. Paul says, I plead with them to be of the same mind. Same mind. Many scholars think that it's possible that Paul wrote the first 3 chapters of Philippians really to form the backdrop for this particular moment. In other words, this is not an afterthought. This is the working out of what Paul has been saying in the rest of the letter, because he talks about being united with Christ and united with each other quite a bit in this book. When you get to the end of the first chapter and he begins working all this out, he says, you've been united with Christ because it's been granted to you, Christians, to believe in him and also to suffer with him. And everybody's going, hey, I'm good with the believing part. That sounds like a great gift. I'm not sure that being granted suffering with him is a gift. What does that mean exactly? Well, here's what Paul says. Philippians chapter 2. I want you to pay attention to wording that talks about being united with Christ or being of one mind. Paul says, if you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, if any comfort from his love, if any common sharing in the Spirit, if any tenderness and compassion, then make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and of one mind. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others. So there's kind of a way in Greek and even in English to say if but not. So like, if I were king, but I'm not. There's another way of saying, if I were there and I am. That's what Paul's saying here. We parents have a way of doing this. We will say things like, did I buy your clothes? Yes. Did I wash your clothes? Yes. Did I dry your clothes? Yes. Then is it too much to ask for you to fold your clothes? We kind of lead people and trap them into saying yes. That's what Paul's doing here. Like, if you have these things and you do, if you have this and you do, then make my joy complete. What he's saying here is that to be united with Christ means to have the same mind, have the same love, the same spirit. You have all these things, all this encouragement and comfort, so then do these things. And I find that most of us can understand maybe what it means to have the same love, maybe even the same spirit. But when we talk about having the same mind, that can be confusing. Here's what I know. Having the same mind has nothing to do with having the same backgrounds. Because all through the New Testament, Paul and other writers are having to deal with people of different backgrounds who are now joined together in Jesus. They have very different beliefs on how much of their background they should bring in. It doesn't mean that we have the same social status, because James is having to deal with a church who's working that out. They are still of the same mind, but they don't have the same social status. And it really doesn't have anything to do with having the same opinions about so many things, because Paul has to address a couple of churches who have very different opinions about things like which holy days to celebrate and what foods are okay to eat and what other practices from their past they should bring in. It doesn't have anything to do with those things. So I started thinking about what image would make sense to talk about the same mind that even uses some of the same, maybe some of the same imagery that we would think of. So I thought of the phrase, putting your heads together. Put your heads together. This is great artwork you're going to see here on the screen, folks. Putting your heads together. It has to do, I think, with a common purpose. And if there's something that needs to be done or achieved, we might tell people to get in a room and put your heads together. That's what I think one mind means. It's about a common purpose, a common sharing, a common goal. So Jesus has this single-minded purpose, this goal. He's headed toward the cross, toward the grave, toward his resurrection. And Paul knows, as he tells the Philippians, that one of the things that can get in the way of a common goal is our own selfish ambition, our own pride. Because then all of a sudden, I'm over here working on a different goal, and I'm not willing to work toward this common goal with other believers in Christ. If you want to see an example of how this works for good and for bad, you can watch what happens, for instance, when there's disaster relief that needs to happen. Look at the common purpose that's happened even among our church family and others around the country as they give and serve in so many sacrificial ways. But also, like, you get a bunch of people in a room who have different ideas, and sometimes it can be interesting. So in 2013, there were a couple of tornadoes that came through suburbs of Oklahoma City within 2 or 3 weeks of each other. And where I was serving was the largest Church of Christ in the region, and so we didn't plan to, but we became like a clearinghouse for all kinds of goods and people. And so it was amazing to see people with different backgrounds who had taken off work to show up and help. You did have some people who were more interested in kind of being where the action was, whether or not it was helpful. We're going to go down there and we're going to be there at ground zero where it's happening. People were saying, I don't think that's helpful. I don't think they need you down there. No, we got to be there. No, you don't. But then on the other hand, you'd have these people, like you'd have business people who you could tell weren't used to this kind of work maybe in their day-to-day lives. And then you'd have, like, we had a group of guys one morning just drive in from Kentucky, and it was like ZZ Top showed up. I mean, just, they come in like, hey, we got chainsaws in the truck. Where do we go work? And it was just really amazing to see these people with different backgrounds, nothing in common except Jesus, who shared the goal of serving people who were in need. That is what it means to put our heads together and share a common goal. I also think of this church's history. What happens when people get together and say, what if we started a food pantry to serve people in our area who are in need? And then over the years, what if we expanded that to really start serving the unhoused population? That's a goal that we have. And I'm sure in those early days, there were meetings with different approaches and ideas, but that goal was in front of people. Or what are we going to do to serve these women who are being exploited in their work and in other ways? I guarantee there were different perspectives on how to accomplish that. But because of people's common bond in the Lord and this common goal, that expanded into an incredible ministry. Or what do we do with the people in our community? Who are the vulnerable people, the at-risk people in this part of town? And what if they need medical care? Could we start a clinic to serve these people? And were there different ideas about how to accomplish that? I guarantee there were. But because of people's common sharing in the Spirit, their common bond in Jesus Christ, and their single-minded goal to serve this population, there's now a clinic in the basement. Part of it is below my office that has now for 15 or so years served people who need medical care. That's what can happen when we are united with Christ through being of the same mind and sharing those goals. When I talk about this church's history and the more I learn about it, it just makes me excited and it gets my imagination going for what else God might be calling us to do. I don't have any idea what that is, but one of my prayers is that God would begin to reveal to me, to you, some additional ways that we might serve. I don't know what that looks like. One of the things that starts my imagination is when different people who are not talking to each other start saying the same things. I've been really feeling urged to go investigate this. That's really interesting and encouraging when that happens. So when I think about being united, I don't think anything unites us more than a common goal, especially with regard to service and outreach. So I'm just telling you, I'm praying that God would start to spark our imaginations for ways to do that. I know many of you are praying that too because you're telling me this. I'm so thankful for opportunities that exist because of the generosity of so many of you and the eyes that you have to serve people around us. So I'm just kind of asking the I wonder questions these days, and I know some of you are too. And it's exciting to do that, to think of what could happen when we continue to live into this calling to be united with Christ through a common mind. What would it look like? What would it look like for groups of Christians to be fully committed to having the same mind? What if we really got together, or continued to get together, around a common Jesus-aligned purpose? And what would it look like in the world where there aren't headlines about scandals and splits and disagreements among churches, but instead the headlines were as churches got together and found common purpose in serving the world? In a world where Christians who are committed to following the way of Jesus and out of the overflowing love and grace that comes from Jesus, what if those Christians were united with Christ and sacrificing themselves for the good of the world? What part do you have to play in that? So my prayer is that God would continue to pour out his blessings on us, would continue to call us and form us to be united with Christ as we are united with each other, and that God would show up in fresh ways because we share that common bond in Jesus.